at the Communist University. After returning to the United States, he worked to recruit African Americans, especially the agronomist students, because he was an agronomist and a politician who had become a naturalized citizen in Russia. He worked in cotton cultivation, he taught at the Tuskegee Institute, and served as a municipal counselor in Trashkent. Now, Russia was still thinking, how can we get our economic base built? Through Oliver Golden, they learned of the history of George Washington Carver. And they knew with his innovation in agricultural techniques and his work on soil improvement and crop diversification, Carter's methods were sure to work in the Soviet Union. So they sent Golden on the recruitment task of getting Carter to come to the Soviet Union. Now Carter is an esteemed and renowned inventor and agronomist, and he said, no, I am working for the American people. What would my people think if I now came to the Soviet Union, a communist area? So Golden couldn't persuade him to come to the Soviet Union. But what he could do was persuade him to give a list of colleges that he could go and visit and recruit. So Carter felt this would be okay. He also knew of the opportunities that Russia offered that the United States did not. Carter also knew that most of the people that he would recommend were students of his or those who had studied under him. So he knew that he was sitting the best and the brightest. Oliver was pleased with this. And so Oliver Golden, played the significant role of recruiting Rome and John Sutton to come to Russia. And before the ship left from New York, Oliver Golden had recruited 14 agronomists and agricultural students from the United States' top colored colleges. He was pleased. The recruitment efforts but they were not limited to just the southern part of the states. He also recruited in the northern area. And from this group, of all of the universities that he could master to travel to, the ones that we will talk about today are John Wesley Sutton, who went to Russia in 1930, and Joseph J. Rome, who went to Russia in 1931. Now, this is the time of the Great Depression. So we all know that not only was the African American struggling, and the fields sometimes were barren, but so were white folks. Everybody was struggling. This was the Depression, but we as the African descendant struggled the hardest. Now, John Wesley Sutton, as I said, was born in Ohio. He never attended Tuskegee, but he went to Tuskegee to work under George Washington Carver. John Sutton came from a very large family. He was one of 12. And John Sutton became an agronomist that George Washington Carver knew that he was proud to send to Russia. Now we're looking on this side. Joseph J. Rome was born in Kremlin, Virginia, right here in Westmoreland County. He attended Norfolk State, which at that time was a community college, and it was Eckridge. And then he matriculated to Virginia State College, where he graduated with a degree in agronomy. Joseph Rome also came from a large family of 11. See the parallel? Now, I'm sure that when they both agreed to go to Russia, they did not do their due diligence in researching what they were walking into, or in this case, sailing into. Now, in Texas, the temperature wasn't that much different than here in Virginia. But in Russia, the coldest month of the year was January. The average low temperature was 17.6 degrees. The high was 23 degrees. The warmest month was July, with an average low of 66.7 degrees and an average high of 75.6 degrees. So now we can see why certain thing about Joseph translates to Joseph. So he was still named after his father, Joseph Rome. Now, returning to the United States, both Rome and Sutton likely noticed very few changes when they returned. We're still in the Depression. The racial discrimination and the segregation was still as big and bold as ever. They both faced significant challenges and discrimination throughout their entire lives, especially given that they came back from a communist country. There were those who looked at them suspect. Are they? Did they? No, neither of them joined the Communist Party. Rome came back to his hometown of Kremlin, Virginia. Sutton stopped in New York for a brief period of time where he taught at the University in New York. Rome came back to Virginia just around the time that the first African American high school was being built. This was in 1936. This was the only secondary facility offered to the students of African descent in Westmoreland County, keeping in mind that the educational journey for others started in the 1800s, and they had secondary education. Both Rome and Sutton, they contributed to their communities. They made sure that the students that they taught learned from the experiences that they had gained in Russia and perfected in Russia, but came back home to share and grow new farms. They were both passionate about their trade. And here I'm going to drop off Sutton, because I think we know that Sutton, from a large family, and some of us may have heard the name of one of his brothers, which was Percy Sutton, who owned a large media company in New York. All 12 of Sutton's siblings had college degrees. All 12 of his siblings made massive contributions to both Texas, New York, and wherever they decided to call home. Joseph Rome, on the other hand, let's remember, His journey began in the fields of Colonial, Virginia. Then he moved from the fields of Virginia to the cotton fields of Uzbekistan. He never worked in the cotton fields in the United States, but he did in Uzbekistan. And then he circled back to Colonial, Virginia, where he became a revered educator and an active public citizen. Mr. Rome retired in 1971 after teaching in Westmoreland County Schools for 34 years. Remember, he also taught 6 years in Russia. He was a professional civic and Soviet activist for his country. He founded the Virginia Farmers American Program for African American high school students, and he founded the Virginia Colored Farmers Association. He held offices in the National Treasurers Association he was a treasurer of the National Teachers Association. He was a member of the NAACP, the Virginia State University Alumni Chapter, as well as serving as a consultant to the Virginia Fisheries Laboratory and Forestry Association, and to the Virginia Polytech Institute and the state of Virginia. So, Rome's professional successes anywhere that he went and worked earned him the respect of the United States government and the Soviet Union alike. And I did just have to have expounded on Mr. Rome's history, because Mr. Rome was homegrown. And sometimes when we are studying history, we don't look within. We always think that history, that journey, that accomplishment is far more important than what I know, but it is not. And what I think that I've always tried to do since we established the A.T. Johnson Museum is to tell our local histories and our local trailblazers, because we have so much history right here in Westmoreland County that we need not always go out and look for history. We just need to look over our shoulder. The other thing, I want to thank the Historical Society for inviting me here, because it's necessary that we talk about our histories. And when we do, we build our historical societies. Now, we think of this, some of us, as Black History Month. We might think of this journey of Rome and Sutton as a Black history journey, but it's not only a Black history journey. It happens to be a journey that impacted two countries that just happen to have been by the African American. So this is one of the reasons that I think we need to talk about history as history first. Because the impact of history really should not fit in any box, because it touches everybody and makes everybody's life the better for their journey. So, thank you so much for your attention. I hope what I have done, if nothing else, was instilled in you a thirst to go out and research these two men. Because I may not have told you the truth. But I want you to go out and do the research yourself, so that you will know that I indeed shared the journey of these two men that knew not of each other. They came from different parts of the United States, But the similarity was the journey of their life, of the racism that they both witnessed and lived, of the fact that they both wanted something better, of the fact that even though they knew nothing of Russia, because in 9 years, how much could have been shared in history books? But they did know that Oliver Golden and George Washington Carver were folks that they respected and felt would not share anything with them that was not for the betterment of them, and the fact that they could, in some small way, make life better through their field of study of agronomy. Thank you. Now, keep those degrees in mind, because in Virginia, the average low for January was 34.7 degrees, and the high was 47.4 degrees. The warmest month was July, but the average low was 69 degrees, and the average high was 88 degrees. So you can see where the challenge for the agronomy students are: how to produce a strand of cotton that would grow in this kind of conditions. Now, when Roan and Sutton got to Uzbekistan, the living conditions was much, much better than they would have received here had they stayed, even with their degrees. But it still wasn't that good. Mm-hmm. But one of the things that propelled them to go was that the Russians said, we will put you up in housing far superior to what you have here. We will give you $500 a month. Now, just think about this. During the Depression, African American descended folks making $500 a month, unheard of. So you can see the attraction of going there. They were told what their task would be. They would, and they did complete this task successfully. They were introducing advanced cultural practices, sharing knowledge of crop rotation and soil management, which were very new. These were things that even we here in the United States hadn't capitalized on yet. They would be training local farmers, conducting workshops all through the region. And they would help these farmers adapt to these new techniques. Change is slow, and sometimes we don't like it. And so did the farmers in Russia. Not like some of the changes that these two professors were trying to impose on them. They had to collaborate with the leadership in Russia. So this meant that not only did they have to convince the local farmers and the community that these practices would work, they also had to convince the government that what they were doing would be a benefit to them. And they did. John and Joe, working side by side, developed a strand of cotton in Russia that would grow in those conditions that we just talked about. The one thing that we'd like to remember, that strand of cotton is still being grown in Russia today. So they were successful. And when that became a success, they were then tasked with other things. Joseph Roan came from a large family that held acreages, hundreds of acreages of land here in Westmoreland County. But also, they had a cannery. So now his task is to build a cannery and to what? Yes. And make sure that the community knew how to can. This was new to them. John Sutton developed a strand of rope that was unique to Russia, that could withstand the temperature changes, but still not lose any of its strength. So their experiences in Russia influenced not only their working conditions, but also their teachings, because they were contributing to an agricultural advancement and education. They both worked at the Tashkent University. Now, one of the milestones that Rome came home boasting about was that he and his wife Sadie became the parents to the firstborn African-American child born in Russia to two African descended people. So this was unheard of, because a lot of Africans would come over, and because there was no racial barrier, they would marry. But there were few other Africans that would marry each other. Joseph and Sadie went to Russia as a married couple, both having graduated from Virginia State the same year. Both traveled within months of their graduation to Russia. So this was a milestone and a historical significant point. Because now this little baby that's born to these two black parents in Uzbekistan, and you have to remember, it was new. People would come from look and go, But remember, we were in a communist state. We have to find a name for this boy. So the parents, of course, wanted to name him Joseph. The government decided that his name would be Joseph Stalin Kim Rome.
Could you talk a little bit about also the A.T. Johnson Museum for people that maybe have not been there?
I can, I would. I'm excited to do that. But I would like to offer this gift to the Historical Society. This is the documentary, Kremlin to Kremlin, the Joseph J. Rome story.
That one more time so I can take a picture now.
Which part?
Fake hug.
The fake hug.
There we go.
That was the real one. It's the real hug.
Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yes.
It's really interesting that he was born in Kremlin in Westmoreland County, and Kremlin is a Russian, to us, Russian.
Yeah. Is there any connection
between Russia and where he was born?
Yes. In the Kremlin area, there was a small population of Russians who lived in that area. So we think that's how it got its name. The other thing is, which is, I'm glad you mentioned that, because when Rome was trying to come home, and he went to the embassy to get his passport, because of course when he got there, they took his passport, because they wanted to make sure he would leave before the crop was ready. And he went to the embassy to get his passport, and they're gonna be, where are you from? And he says, Kremlin, Virginia, and they're gonna go, yeah, no, that's not where you're from. So it did delay his return, because the embassy in Russia had to connect with the embassy in Washington to be assured that there was indeed a Kremlin, Virginia, where this Joseph Rome says he was from. Yes. Yes, sir.
Was there any mention of a language barrier at that time?
There was. And the thing is, it took 14 days to travel from New York to Uzbekistan. And during that time, there were tutors on board that taught them Russian. Now, Mr. Rohn, on the other hand, learned very little Russian on his trip to Russia because he had just gotten married.
He didn't have time.
He was busy. Thus, the young Joseph.
Yes.
Is that picture, is there anyone in the picture that?
Oh, yes.
that makes-
This is Joseph J. Rohn.
Joseph J. what?
Rohn.
Oh, that's it.
This is he.
Oh, that's he.
And this is doing the recognition, I might add, of students of the A.T. Johnson High School that had just won a state championship. Now,
Question.
Third from the right.
oh, this is Mr. Rohn. Yes. Mr. Rohn is the person in the middle. Now, one of the things going for Mr. Rohn, he actually looked more like a Uzbekistan person than he did an African American. But that just meant that he was tall and doubly good looking. Yes, sir.
Was the baby considered a Russian citizen?
Yes.
I wondered if.
So-
Yes.
So did they have any trouble bringing him back to the States?
No, because he was under 6 at the time. So he traveled with his parents.
Trump was president.
Excuse me?
Trump was not president.
And Trump was not the president. True indeed. True indeed. Now, there is another interesting tidbit about their return to Russia. Because when they were in Russia, they spoke only Russian. Unless a delegate no English. And when they stopped over in New York for a period of time, and they were walking through the streets of New York, young Joseph heard Russian being spoken. So he separated himself from the family for a couple of days because he understood what the Russians were saying. He had not a clue to what the Americans were saying. So they spent 2 days walking through New York looking for this young boy. They found him. They found him. An interesting story, though, is when he did come down here to Westmoreland and spoke no English, Dr. Fears was one of the people who taught him English. So, that was cool. So she and her counterpart, who lives close by to Joseph, spent a lot of time talking to him in English and probably learned a whole lot of Russian on the side. Yes, ma'am.
Some of us who've been involved in the Westmoreland NAACP Union's Odessa brother.
Yes.
President.
Yes.
For many years. Is she a descendant of this?
No, she actually married
She married.
Mr. Rohn's brother.
Okay.
So that's how she became a Rohn. But another interesting thing about Mr. Rohn, his sister lived right here at Colonial back in the 40s. Lola Rohn, you knew her. Did she teach you?
No, I heard of her. I was trying to learn as much as I could about her. If I'm not mistaken, didn't she live somewhere down this area of the beach?
Yes, she did.
On that's what we call Washington Avenue now?
Yes, she did.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, she did.
She was one of the few, as far as I know, during that time, the only person of color that lived anywhere down this end of the beach besides Jackson Street, or that was it in this town.
That is correct. Yes, ma'am. Yes, there were two others. Oh, Garland. But he was on Colonial Avenue.
Yeah, he was on Colonial Avenue, but that was like part.
Yeah, that there was a dividing line in Colonial Beach.
Right.
It was Colonial Avenue, people think it was Boundary, but it wasn't.
No, it's
It was
Colonial.
But
Right.
actually, up after I wanna say 1931, 32, 33, Jackson Street was basically the only street that African Americans lived on in this town.
This is
So
correct.
that, or they pushed them all to what they call the old road, that is behind Halls,
Yes.
behind Food Line.
Absolutely.
Or up and behind Halls, what they call the Swamp, or up and, they went to Oak Road.
That is-
Before that, they owned everywhere along this beach.
That is absolutely
Everywhere they owned this beach.
And the wonderful thing about that is that you remember that. And the other thing that's important is to remember that during the time when Mr. Rome came back, is when these businesses in Colonial Beach that were African American owned started popping up. So that's an invitation for another visit today. But the one thing that is equally important is that Mr. Rome spent a lot of time up here teaching how to use the waterways to find food. So his teachings was not limited just to farming. But the other thing that he did, it was not limited to just the African American community. Every Saturday morning, Mr. Rome would go to a different general store and hold court for anyone that wanted to come out, and he would teach them the new methods of farming, the waterways, of forestry. So he was that person who made sure that his teachings made a better Westmoreland County.
Didn't he teach at A.T. Johnson?
He did. He taught at A.T. Johnson. He was there when we were there.
Yes, he was. That name was big.
Yes.
No, I knew.
And also, William Johnson
Yes.
owned property in Colonial Beach on the waterfront because he had the business of lugging.
Yes.
And I believe, the town of Colonial Beach did a resolution maybe a couple of 3 years ago, is that correct? So he was African American, and he owned like, pretty much like 2 or 3 properties,
Yes.
right on the waterfront.
He did.
Yeah.
Ham Johnson.
William Johnson.
Yes. And he was one of the few on the waterfront.
Yes.
And we have to remember, Colonial Beach was a sundown town, so that a lot of times, come sundown, we weren't where these businesses were.
And that was still up until the late 70s. It was
Yes.
still a sundown town. I
Yes.
remember when I moved here.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, sir.
Do you know what years they were in the Soviet Union and what prompted them to return to the United States?
They were in the Soviet Union from 1930 to 1936. Part of the reason that they both came back was that they went over on a contract. So their contract ended. However, they weren't forced to come back at that time. They could have stayed, but they would have to have renounced their American citizenship.
It's interesting that around that same time, there was a very famous Russian scientist named Lysenko, who was very much anti-Mendelian genetics, and they started persecuting people who did research on plant breeding and people were actually executed. And so it's actually fortunate that they came back, otherwise they probably would have been severely persecuted by the Stalin government at that time.
Definitely, and this was one of the reasons that we think Rome decided that he would come back. Not to mention that he had a large family here that he had not seen and very little communicating with since he had left. During that time, 30, 35, 36, was indeed the time that people were just picked up for conversations that somebody overheard, and they were never seen or heard of again. This happened to a lot of the African American population that happened to have married Russians. And the one thing about Golden, he was, excuse me, he was identified to be picked up by the Russian ruler. But because when they went to his house to pick him up, he was in Russia. He was in Africa. So they didn't find him. So that was the only thing that saved him. Now, he died. His family did not make it out of Russia until in the late 70s. And his daughter actually came here to the United States in the 80s because she was trying to put together these bits of histories of these African men, African descendant men, who had gone to Russia to make it economically feasible. And she interviewed Mr. Rohn. Of course, there were several in this area, on the East Coast, that had gone and had come back. And she interviewed all of them. The one thing that I remember about her, and this ties into the A.T. Johnson Museum, is that Oliver Golden's first wife was Jewish from New York. And of course that was not to be. So that too propelled him to go to Russia. The one thing, his wife came from a very prominent Jewish family. And she only took a couple of things with her: a sewing machine and a typewriter. And, and over the years, people said, well, why didn't you take more? And she said, because I knew where I was going. Far be it for me to come over with, a lot of luggage, a lot of frills, and a lot of things that they did not have. In the end, she ended up having to sell her sewing machine, but she kept her typewriter. And on this typewriter was where she produced the letters that Oliver Golden was sending back to George Washington Carver. Interestingly, we at the A.T. Johnson Museum have a typewriter that Mr. Rohn also brought back.
That's amazing.
Yes, sir. Yes, ma'am.
I probably should know this, but where is the museum?
You should.
Unfortunately, it's not publicized about this area.
I can tell you.
Really? Well,
the schools and things,
Yeah.
my daughters had no clue that the museum is at A.T. Johnson.
So where is it?
The A.T. Johnson Museum is where the Human Resource Building is in
Social
Montrose.
services.
Social services, yes. The social service on the other end. The social services complex was the A.T. Johnson complex.
Right.
So, yes, ma'am.
I went there for a Juneteenth thing that was going on. That was, I think, right before COVID, and spent the whole day from the morning to evening, and it started there at the museum, I think.
Yes.
And we had a person lecturing, and she had written a book, do you remember?
Dr. Deese.
Professor?
Dr. Deese. Professor Deese.
Yes. It was lovely, and then we took off from there, went to Stratford Hall and spent the day.
Yes.
And then we ended up, my friend and I stayed until about 9 o'clock at night having dinner with everybody.
Yes, that was a great time, wasn't it?
So I've been in that museum, and it is very interesting, and it's not far. It's right outside of
Right. If you know where the food line is, right. It's about 1.5 miles from the food line in Montrose, going south.
Right.
Or west. Oh, going down through. Yes, ma'am.
Where is Westmoreland County geographically is
It's in the southern part of Westmoreland County. It's, the Kremlin area is off 202, and it's near Hague, and between Hague and Warsaw. Yes.
On the back road.
Now, if you know about your chairman, Fisher, his church is in Cremon, Jerusalem Baptist Church.
Yes.
Yes. Namanai, the plantation. Yes. Yes, sir.
Does his family still own property down here?
Yes. Oh, wait a minute, whose family? Mr. Roan? Mr. Roan's,
Does his family still own property?
Mr. Roan's family, his only son was Joseph. So they do not own that property that they came back with. But the Roan family, the extended family, yes, they own property in Westmoreland still.
Other than the food line mark, is there an physical address for that building?
It is, it's 11849 Kings Highway, Montrose, Virginia. So if you put it in your GPS, it will bring you right there. Now, the one thing you want to look for is that it will probably drop you at the social services complex. And then what you will notice is that there's a building that's annexed to the long social services complex, which is the original A.T. Johnson building. Yes, ma'am.
What happened to the son?
Joseph died, 2019. The other thing is that ties the Roan family to this area. In addition to Mr. Roan's sister Lola Roan having lived here, Joseph taught at Washington District Elementary School.
What year was that that he taught?
I want to say it was in 65 to 67, somewhere around that.
So would that have been,
Right after,
is
Mrs.
that where the
Jenkins.
Washington District is now? It's
Yes.
where the original school is?
Yes,
And that was in what year?
I think, now this is where you might want to do your own research. I want to say it may have been somewhere between 65 and 68.
That's probably around the time when they shut down the school here, that is the school board now, and my husband, that's where he went to school at, and he lived on the old road, and they bust all of the African-American children. One day came in and said, y'all cannot go to school here anymore, and took them to that school. That's when they opened that up for the children in this area, the black children who couldn't go to that school building anymore.
That
And they
is
had to
true.
go to that one. So I'll have to ask him about that when I get home.
Yes.
Yes, when I ask if he remembers. He'd have
Absolutely.
been about 8, 9 years old.
Yes.
He was like in the second grade.
It would have
when
been
that
the
happened.
elementary
Yes,
school,
ma'am.
indeed. But, so what the story also tells us is that how connected we are to each other.
Yes.
And that we think of, sometimes you may think of Colonial Beach as not a part of Westmoreland County, but really you